Passionate, outspoken, insightful. Ariva Martin is an award-winning civil rights attorney. Passionate, outspoken. Passionate, outspoken, insightful. Ariva Martin is an award-winning civil rights attorney, best-selling author, legal commentator, and America's advocate. Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Good morning and welcome to our viewers in the U.S. and around the world. To kick off this morning's broadcast, do me a favor, please share the show with your online friends or start a viewing party. And remember to post a comment or question. Your voice matters, and I want to hear from you. We are less than 69 days from the November presidential election, and there is now a full court press by the Democrats and Republicans to make their case to the American people. The Democrats had their first virtual convention last week where they made history by nominating the first African American woman to the top of a major political ticket. This week, the Republicans were up, and in the first day of the RNC, it was either 4 years of Donald Trump or an American apocalypse. As speaker after speaker warned of vengeful mobs of anarchists invading the suburbs if Trump is not reelected to protect, quote unquote, Western civilization as we know it. Not more than 24 hours later, on day two, Trump was cast as the protector of religious freedoms, freedom of speech, and a champion of African Americans and suburban women. On day two, the campaign tried to convince viewers that Trump was not anti-immigration, sexist, or racist. And sunny promises for the future, the illness and economic devastation of the coronavirus was barely acknowledged, nor was the 180,000 Americans who have died from COVID-19. Also absent from day two was mention of the Black Lives Matter protest happening in the streets of Wisconsin over the police shooting of Jacob Blake in the back 7 times. Or was there any mention of the protesters in the streets of Kentucky demanding the arrest of the cops who killed Breonna Taylor? Are the shameless efforts to recast the president's image as an inclusive leader, welcoming to immigrants, eager to promote women and embrace racial diversity? Is this resonating with voters beyond his loyal base? And more importantly, is this message resonating with voters in key swing states like Michigan and Florida? Let's discuss. My first guest is Michigan State Representative Donna Lazinski, and also joining me is Florida State Senator Audrey Gibson. Good morning, ladies.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to talk to both of you because you are both, Audrey and Donna, you ladies are in some pretty critical states. And when I looked at the Republican National Convention over the last 2 days, my mind was on those swing states. So I want to ask you, Audrey, did you see anything over the last 2 days that you think will resonate with voters in the state of Florida?
And thank you so much for having me. If you like violence, if you like a call to arms, if you don't have the heart of the people in your heart and believe in upward mobility and social goodness, then the messages would have resonated with you.
How about you, Donna? Did you hear or see, anything in the last 2 days that you think really touched the hearts of anyone living in Michigan?
No, I did not. I think what's become clear in Michigan is that the Trump brand is the Republican brand. In Michigan, we are seeing it echoed by our candidates who are running in our top races. We're 4 seats away from flipping the Michigan House in Michigan and gaining control of the chamber. We gained control, Democratic control of all the top offices with women last election, from governor to secretary of state to attorney general. I'll just throw out one example. As you said, there was no empathy expressed last night for the nearly 200,000 people who have died from the coronavirus in the United States. And when we look at Michigan, we were particularly hard hit in our Black communities in Detroit. Where President Trump says it is what it is, in response to the number of deaths that we've had, we hear our Senate Republican majority leader saying, Michiganders are just going to have to, quote, suffer through it, unquote. There was nothing last night that gave us hope.
Yeah, and both of you are in critical states where the suburbs, the suburbs play an oversized role in every presidential election, and it will play a big role in the November election. And we saw efforts by the RNC to create this fear that somehow if Donald Trump isn't elected, these mobs of anarchists and lawless people are going to invade the suburbs. And they even use the McCloskeys, Mark and Patricia, who came to national attention because they were literally pointing guns at peaceful protesters in St. Louis. And I should note the community where the McCloskeys live is not a suburban community. It's in the heart of St. Louis City. It's very much an enclave in urban St. Louis, but they use them to deliver this message about, and they even use the word invade the suburbs. So how do you think that message, Audrey, I'll go back to you, Florida being such a critical state, do you think, watching those two very prominent, super successful lawyers sitting on their couch in that house that looked like, some kind of mausoleum, or talk about being invaded by the suburbs, did that play to anyone in Florida?
Certainly, I would hope not. Listen, we're in this entire country and in our states, including Florida. There's a war that's being stoked by General Trump, and he's pitting people against each other that he claims to care about, or he claims to believe and love this country. Well, we are a country of immigrants, and we are a country of diversity, as is Florida. And so I don't see the love. I don't believe Floridians see the love. And as a swing state, I live in a swing county that I believe will be the key county in Jacksonville, Duval County, to swing Florida. Duval County has tended to be very red in the past, but there has been a change in the dynamics and a change in the population. And we saw just in the governor's election last cycle that Duval County went blue. And so that was part of the reason they wanted to bring the killer RNC convention to Jacksonville. Of course, we stopped that. But I hope people are paying attention. And let me tell you something I noticed last night, just as an aside, when we talk about inciting fear and division and hate at the performance of the naturalization. And I'm certainly proud that those individuals wanted to become Americans at a time when we are all being pitted against each other and Black lives don't matter. It wasn't lost on me that the first person the general introduced was standing next to him, and then the next person standing next to that gentleman was the African American, or the African American gentleman, and then the other ladies. So he introduced the first person closest to him, which was the gentleman, I think was from Bolivia. He skipped the African American and introduced the others, no disrespect to them. And the African American went last. For me, it was a code. It just showed that why not go person by person by person as they were lined up, but you skip the person that's next to the person that you first introduced, and then you introduce that person last. There's that in and of itself speaks to me about who Mr. Trump is and continues to be, and he sends these signals out to his base.
So Audrey, you saw that as more of the racist dog whistle that we've seen this president use throughout the last 3.5 years. But now and I'm glad you brought up that naturalization ceremony, because one of the things that struck me about last night, again, was this effort to try to recast Trump as this pro-immigration president. And what we know about those naturalization, that ceremony, is that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are waiting to have their naturalization ceremony so that they can vote in this November election. And Trump's administration is refusing to allow those naturalization ceremonies to take place over Zoom. And they obviously can't take place in person, but yet he would use those 5 individuals to somehow suggest that he is embracing people from all nations. Again, I'll ask you, Donna, is that this new pro-immigration Trump, do you think Michigan voters are buying that?
No, I don't. And I don't have to look very far for that evidence. As I said, we're competing to flip the House in the state of Michigan right now by 4 seats. And what we see is their candidates in their top tier races. So these aren't just that person who's running in that seat way over to the side that nobody pays attention to. In their top tier races, one of their candidates has made explicit calls, public calls, for violence against Muslims. He's made calls for Obama to be executed. They have another candidate who worked in the Trump administration, worked with Mitch McConnell, who put up an agenda on her website very tied to the Trump and McConnell agendas, where they were banning folks from Muslim-based countries and from other countries that we all know they used a colorful expletive to describe. She has since realized that that is not what Michiganders want. And that's not what folks want in her district. She's actually scrubbed her website of those statements. We're not going to let them get away with that. We are not going to let them get away with, in these waning days of the election, attempting to redefine themselves away from their abhorrent, racist, xenophobic behavior.
I want to ask you about voter suppression. We know that played a big role, and a lot of what we saw at this convention, I would say, was designed to suppress the vote, to scare you at least into not voting. But Trump narrowly won Florida, Audrey, in 2016. And we know a lot of it had to do with voter suppression efforts by foreign governors, foreign governments like Russia, and misinformation campaigns that were widely utilized across the internet. What is happening in Florida today to combat those types of misinformation campaigns and those kind of voter suppression tactics?
Well, fortunately, many of us, and I am on the ground as well, continually talking to people. We just had a primary, and so everything went very smoothly. And obviously, with COVID-19, there were many more requests for vote by mail ballots. And so I believe for us in this state, that the primary was a good opportunity for how we need to proceed in November, ensuring, number one, that people who request their ballots got their ballots. But in between, I've said this to my Democratic local chair here in Jacksonville, we have to also make sure that we have education with that. And that is, as I don't anticipate that COVID, since we don't have any national or state leadership on how we should proceed, I don't anticipate that the environment will change by election time in November. And so we need to make sure that people update their signatures, that they're requesting their ballots timely, that they know how to complete them and sign them, and that they make sure that when they run out of time, you can't send your ballot back. And so we're engaged already in how we want to proceed in November to ensure that people are allowed to vote. We now have a ridiculous 150 feet from the polling place, and we will follow those guidelines, but we want to make sure that the Republicans follow those guidelines as well.
Well, we know that Twitter helped with a recent tweet where Trump tweeted that somehow drop boxes for ballots were not COVID sanitized. And Twitter actually put a warning sign up that this was misinformation as it relates to this particular tweet, where, again, efforts to suppress the vote and scare people away from voting, and suggesting that somehow if you go out and drop a ballot in one of these drop-off boxes that you're going to contract COVID or something nonsensical like that. So we want to thank Twitter for fact-checking the president in real time. I want to go back to the convention, though, and ask you about Pam Bondi. So Pam Bondi, we know, controversial figure, accepted a $25,000 donation to her campaign when she was Attorney General for Florida that was written out of the Trump 501c nonprofit account, which is illegal to make a political donation out of a 501c corporation. So we know she's been embroiled in her own controversy, but she tried to cast Joe Biden and his family as somehow being corrupt, and that nepotism would run amok under a Biden administration. Now, she failed to mention that Eric Jr. or Eric Trump has been subpoenaed in the state of New York for his dealings with the Trump organization, that organization has been sued by the Attorney General, and all the other, criminal like activities that have surrounded the Trump administration. And not to mention that we have already seen 3 of his adult kids speak at the convention, and we know the 4th one, Ivanka, is going to be speaking over the next 2 days. So I'm not sure who Pam Bondi was talking to, but I'll ask you again, Donna, do you think that somebody out there may have thought, oh my God, Joe Biden and his family are the corrupt ones, and Donald Trump and his children are, the symbols of morality, which is what Pam Bondi in that speech tried to convince us of?
Look, it's starting to look like the Osmond show up there, where the only folks you can get to speak or to entertain, quite frankly, because I really think that's what's happening with the Republican National Convention, is an attempt to entertain. There's no serious discussion of policy. There's no serious discussion of a path forward for our nation in terms of recovering from the pandemic, let alone just making it through the pandemic, keeping folks healthy, keeping folks safe. We saw example after example of, not wearing masks, not social distancing. We saw leadership that is clearly indifferent to the deaths of Americans. When we look at that idea of corruption, I honestly don't think we should spend time talking about it. It's completely fabricated. It is not a valid point. And we need to look at the policies that are going to move America forward. And quite frankly, that is making sure that we have folks who are following health advice, getting us to stop the spread of this virus, moving towards a healthcare system that can effectively reach every person in this country, both with prevention measures and measures when they become ill, and then recover the economy in a way that makes sense. We have to recognize in Michigan, we're recovering our economy at one of the fastest rates in the nation. We are also, under our Governor Whitmer's leadership, one of the states that took fairly aggressive measures early on and now are being able to move steadily back to a recovering economy. We're now 7th in the nation after being a top state hit with death and illness. We're 7th for an economic recovery speed. And so what we know, leaders make a difference. Democrats make a difference in how people are affected by the virus and how quickly we recover from the economy. And Democrats have the right policy on both sides of that issue.
Yeah. Before I let you, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, Donna, and I just want to ask you, Audrey, before I let you ladies go, Melania Trump. So we know when she gave her speech in 2016, a very studious journalist was quick to point out that she had plagiarized that speech. So I think the bar going into this speech was so low, but she's getting a lot of praise for, kind of bringing down the rhetoric and having at least acknowledged the 180,000 people that have died for coronavirus. But do you think we should take seriously the statement that she made about her husband, Donald, working tirelessly to make sure that anyone that's been impacted by the virus, has what they need, and that he's going to continue to fight for individuals who've been impacted by COVID? You smile. So.
Perhaps she genuinely believes that, but every one in this country knows and can attest to the fact that it has not been done. The president's only focus has been how we can just keep moving and get business going. Healthcare of the American public be damned. He started out with, it was a hoax? All of these things to not give recognition to the fact that our country has been taken over by COVID-19, and he has not paid attention to their health, more about the bottom line. And we cannot recover if our country is sick. So we have to take the steps to do what needs to be done to get through this period. And we can't do it when he refuses to wear a mask. Not one person in the Rose Garden had on a mask. Nobody had on a mask anywhere that I saw last night. And so either he takes it seriously, and people, all voters, regardless of party, should pay attention to that, because without your health, you can do nothing. You can do nothing. No health, no wealth. He has mentioned no plan about healthcare. I appreciate the HBCUs mentioned, but what about the disparities in healthcare in this country that have come to light under COVID-19? What about those kids who have no access to the internet to be able to do their work? There's no focus on that, but he wants to denigrate the public schools and the teachers with this whole school choice thing, to the detriment of those public schools. And the last thing I will say, and I know I'm taking a little bit longer, but I want to make sure that people, your listeners and viewers, understand the policy conversations that didn't happen that will impact their lives. And my last story is this. When the Republicans have talked about these past couple of days, oh, the Democrats are going to raise your taxes, and the biggest tax hike under President Obama and Vice President Biden. That's a lie. The biggest tax hike happened under Trump. And let me tell you my story. So my 91-year-old dad, who's legally blind, we filed his taxes this year, right? He's not a rich man. He's comfortable. This year, for the first time in years, he owed over $1,000, close to $2,000 to the IRS because of the Trump tax changes. Thank you very much.
Well, we've got to leave it there. We're sorry that your 91-year-old dad had to pay taxes, because we know lots of billionaires are not paying taxes.
Right.
But thank you both ladies for joining me this morning. We're going to be looking at Michigan. We're going to be looking at Florida, and counting on you ladies and your efforts and your energies to help us flip those states back in the Democratic column. So again, thank you, and thank you for all of your hard work.
Thank you.
Wow. So we're talking about the RNC convention. And the question is, will the conventions have an impact on real voters in November? A group called Republican Voters Against Trump put together this video. Take a look.
Clearly, there needed to be some major change.
And along came Donald Trump. It just didn't sound like any politician I'd ever heard before. I thought I'd be a Republican all of my life. But Donald J. Trump has broken my faith in the Republican Party.
My problem with him is that he lies.
Donald Trump is a pathological liar.
He's not a conservative. His spending, his deficit.
His mishandling of the coronavirus.
He belittles those who disagree with him. He calls them names like a middle school child.
I'm tired of being embarrassed.
I have been riddled with guilt.
I am ashamed to this day for voting for him.
We've had enough.
Voting for Donald Trump has been a monumental mistake.
I'll take anybody over him.
I'm voting for Joe Biden.
Joe Biden.
Donald Trump has to go.
It's okay to change your mind. We did.
Now let's talk to voters who have actually changed their minds. Welcome Mike, Daniel, and Nancy. Good morning.
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 Thank you so much for joining me. I want to start with you, Nancy. You are a special education teacher and a lifelong Republican.
Yeah.
You voted Republican since 1976, but you say this November you are voting for Joe Biden. I want to ask you, what was your aha moment?
Well, I wish that I had clued in earlier than I did, but it was basically COVID. I was very disengaged politically. I didn't even really watch the news that much. I was just trying to do my life and deal with, everything on my plate. And when COVID happened and school shut down, and I'm sitting there watching those pandemic press conferences that he did, I saw for the first time the depth of his depravity. And I was like, no, we can't do this. And in fact, it was during one of those press conferences that I got on my iPad and changed my voter registration. So, yeah.
And I know you were disturbed, right, by Nancy, by the Tulsa rally.
Yes.
Trump did a rally in Tulsa where lots of people were crowded into an enclosed space, no mask, no social distancing. When you saw those images, did that confirm for you that you had made the right decision in terms of switching your vote from Trump to Biden?
Yeah, I didn't really need the confirmation, but I live near Tulsa, so I felt like kind of like he was gunning for me in a way. Yeah, it just made me so angry that he was doing that in spite of, well, just the fact that he ignores all the science is, I don't understand, how he can do that in the middle of a pandemic, yet he does. So yeah, I was not happy about that. And then when later they came out with the fact that his staff were taking the social distancing stickers off the chairs prior to that,
Did you see anything, Nancy, anything last night, Monday night, that, have caused you to have any regrets, any buyer's remorse?
Oh, no. No. In fact, I have to limit my exposure because I get so angry watching the hypocrisy that is on full display during that convention. I grew up in a Republican family, and the Republicans I grew up with are nothing like these people. He has totally turned the Republican Party into a cult. And yeah, it's no remorse whatsoever. In fact, I'm doing everything I can to make sure that not only does Joe Biden get elected, but our one of our Republican senators is up for re-election this year. And I'm doing everything I can to make sure he leaves too, because he's also betrayed his constituents. So.
All right. Well, we know where Nancy stands on the November election. Now I want to talk to Mike. Mike has changed his vote, but he's changed from voting for Obama in 2008 and now says he's going to vote for Donald Trump in 2016. So I'll ask you, Mike, the same question. What was your aha moment to switch your vote from a Democrat to a Republican, Donald Trump?
Well, Donald Trump, I understand that he can be very rash and the way he says things are very, strong, heartfelt, but I'm a New Yorker as well. And I understand that it's about policy. And Senator Tim Scott and Representative Vernon Jones have done a good job of explaining that we have things like opportunity zones that have brought over $75 billion to underserved communities, permanent funding for historical Black colleges, and also the First Step Act that's releasing a lot of nonviolent criminals that were in prison during the 90s and 94 when Joe Biden said there are predators on the street beyond the pale. To me, it's about the policies that he's passing, not what he's saying, the way he says things.
So I know, Mike, you've said in previous interviews that your father was actually impacted by what you believe to be that 1994 crime bill. Is that what's driving your decision towards Donald Trump? Is it your own father's personal experience with the criminal justice system? My
dad's personal experience was that he was actually deported. Both my parents are immigrants, by the way. He was actually deported in the mid-90s. And I don't begrudge anybody for that. That was his problem. He was a violent offender. And I understand that it's a personal responsibility. I'm a person that believes in freedom and personal responsibility. Just because that happened to him doesn't mean that I have to vote a certain way. Just like my skin color and the fact that my parents are immigrants means I have to vote a certain way. Just to give you an example, my mom in 2016, she voted for Hillary Clinton. Now this time around, she's actually voting for Donald Trump because she has diabetes, high blood pressure. Her medicines have dropped drastically, thanks to the transparency policies of this administration. And even my brother as well. He was on the fence, but now he's voting Trump. And I'm from a Democrat family again, and we're all going Trump in 2020.
Does your family, you mentioned healthcare and your mom's pre-existing condition, diabetes. Does your mom and your family, Mike, have any concerns about the mishandling of the coronavirus and the close to 200,000 people that have died from that virus due to what pretty much every scientific expert says is the mishandling of the virus by the Trump administration?
Well, actually, Andrew Cuomo actually said that, Donald Trump has done a great job, that the federal government has done an amazing job. And Gavin Newsom said, quote, promise made, promise kept. We're talking about ventilators. So Democratic governors have praised them during the coronavirus situation, pandemic. The problem is that now we're going to election season. So I understand that you have to do that. You have to kind of bolster your side, by the way, right? Like, look at the debates between Senator Biden and Senator Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris basically called him a racist and said that he sided with desegregationists. When she was in an interview a few days after she got picked to be VP, she basically said it was a debate. So that just the language they're using now is not reflective of how they actually felt a few months ago at the heart of the pandemic.
Well, you mentioned Andrew Cuomo and Gavin Newsom. I actually live in California, so I've watched Gavin Newsom pretty closely. You do know those snippets that you just described were taken out of context. And yes, they did make those statements, but they've also been, both Cuomo and Newsom, incredibly critical of Trump's handling of the virus and the inability for states to get sufficient PPE and other financial resources that the states need to combat the coronavirus. So we should put in context that yes, they did make some positive statements, but for the most part, their commentary and comments about Trump's handling has been negative. And we should also put Kamala Harris's comment in context. Kamala Harris was very clear that she never called Joe Biden a racist. She talked about a policy that impacted her, a desegregation policy, but she was very clear that she was never calling him a racist, and in fact talked about her enduring and loving relationship with his son and her fondness for the entire Biden family. I want to ask you though, Daniel, you are also in this group of voters who are switching your vote. And you too have been a lifelong Republican, but now say you're voting for Joe Biden. What was that aha moment for you, Daniel? I think we don't have your audio, Daniel. If you could unmute your...
What are we doing there? Hold on.
There you go. Thank you.
Is that better? Okay, yes. Sorry about that.
Aha moment for you.
You have to be smarter than the smartphone. I'm sorry. First of all, thank you for inviting me on. My aha moment came after I had felt for months already that our president, the man that I voted for, and the reason I voted for him was because I wasn't looking for any more politicians or military people to run the country. I thought we needed a CEO, a chief executive business type person to run what's become a huge operation in this world, and that's the federal government. Now, as a traditional Republican, as I like to think of myself, and one who is far more moderate than anything I've seen of recent out of the party, I believe in a small federalist government, I believe in a strong military, and I believe in business. But I also believe in détente and diplomacy, and I believe in respect and mutual respect. I believe racism and reverse racism is just off the charts in what's going on in our country today. And I believe politicians that feed into that or try to distract from that in any way are truly missing the mark and don't have their finger on the pulse of America. So as I was watching him early on, and I'm saying to myself, this man needs to learn diplomacy. He wrote the book called The Art of the Deal, but someone needs to teach him the art of diplomacy. I started to, and my aha moment came at Charlottesville. Ariva, I don't know any good racists. I don't know any good Nazis. I don't know any fine people that live on that side of the fence that I'm glad that I live on the other side of. And with all respect to your current guests, along with myself, I've met Black people who profusely praise what Donald Trump has done for America and for the Black people. What I have a hard time with is when Donald Trump profusely professes what he's done for all of these people, and most of them disagree. I don't know too many people that would compare him to the abolitionist and the original Republican president, Mr. Lincoln. And thus the Lincoln Project was born. And that's how I came to find a little bit of, if you will, company in the fact that my party's gone off the rails. Mm-hmm. The people like Matt Gaetz and Marco Rubio and Ted Yoho, the way that they speak to people, the way that they speak to women, I'm not now, nor have I ever been a candidate for being canonized and given sainthood. But I can tell you that if any one of those men spoke to my daughter the way Mr. Yoho spoke to AOC, who I'm not a fan of, mind you, I'm still concerned about the liberalism of the Democratic Party. I'm not a socialist, and I'm a capitalist, and I'm very thankful for the Affordable Care Act, because I do have pre-existing conditions that would have and would currently make it almost impossible for me to be insured. So what your other guest says about his mother's medication costs coming down, watch what happens to his mother's health care if Mr. Trump dismantles the Affordable Care Act, as he's been seething to do. And that's part of the aha moment, the fine people on both sides of Charlottesville that don't exist. There was only one group of people that had noble cause. The other group of people are disreputable, obnoxious, and disgustingly minded people. And as I said to interviewers at CNN, you can post my name, address, and telephone number for those folks to call me if they'd like to have a conversation or stop by and have a chat about it. I'm not afraid of those people. As a matter of fact, I laugh at the level of stupidity, inhumanity, decency, and anything else that has to do with us all living and leaving a glorious planet behind for our generations to come. And this man, Mr. Trump, is woefully, I switched from him needing to learn diplomacy for him having to gain mental health care and sanity. The man is off the rails. There's no other way to describe him.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
When I was growing up, my mom taught my sisters and I that if you want to understand somebody's character, that you look at what they've done, not what they say. And I would also add, not what they say they've done. What have they actually done? And when you apply that to President Trump and you apply that to Joe Biden, there's a vast difference in what they've done with their lives. And I think that speaks for itself. You're going to know them by their fruit. And, you know, Trump has gassed peaceful protesters. He's incited racial tensions. He's, you know, and Joe Biden has taken care of his family and lived out his faith. So to me, that's a pretty clear definition.
Ariva,
well, not only Nancy,
Ariva, yeah, I just want you talk about snippets and people being taken out of context. Donald Trump was actually taken out of context in the Charlottesville remarks as well. In the actual video, he did say later on, the white supremacists should be condemned totally. He was not talking about it, the white nationalists or the white supremacists. He made that very clear in the entire video, but a lot of networks have actually cut the video short to or the part where he only says there are fine people on both sides. And I think that the
no, that was after he was reminded that he made such an insensitive remark, Mike. That wasn't him trying to clarify his remark. That was him backtracking like he always does.
And sir, one more second. All his life, there's interviews in 2000, 2005, he's always condemned white supremacy, white nationalism. He wasn't a racist until he won the Republican nomination. Spike Lee was his best friend, Oprah Winfrey.
Wait a minute, Mike. Mike, I got to fact check you on the spot there, Mike. Donald Trump has a history of engaging in racist conduct dating back to.
He has a history of saying things very bluntly.
Wait a minute, Mike. I let you have the last word. I got to fact check you. Dating back to his discriminatory housing policies in New York, his call for the death penalty for the Central Park Five. There's a long list of discriminatory.
The Central Park Five, by the way,
racist comments by Donald Trump. I'm sorry though, Mike. I'm out of time.
That's fine. I totally understand. Thank you for having me, though.
Thank you. I want to thank Mike and Daniel and Nancy. We're going to be coming back to you guys, following you, seeing what happens if more voters are going to flip in this election. But one thing I'm super, super excited about is this election has voters engaged and talking about
Yes,
voting.
it does.
No matter
Definitely.
if you're voting for Trump or Biden, the most important thing is that you vote. So
I
again,
agree.
thank you, Mike. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Ariva. Bless you all.
It
Thanks.
was a pleasure, guys. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Have a conversation about politics without it getting heated, but that's okay because on the special report, we love heated debates. My next guest is legendary Democratic strategist and consultant, Robert Trump. He's worked on presidential campaigns dating back to Ted Kennedy and even John Kerry. He is currently the director at USC Dornsife Center of the Political Future. He's a friend and a go-to expert on all things politics for me. And so I'm super excited to have you back on, Bob, because as you can see from Daniel and Nancy and Mike, voters are fired up. And this is going to be an interesting election. And the RNC is trying to make a play for voters like Nancy who flipped. Do you think they're doing a good job with this convention to speak to the Nancys of the world?
No. First of all, by the way, I'd have to say, I'm thrilled that Mike lives in New York because his vote's not going to matter. Joe Biden's going to carry New York. Secondly, he has a whole series of GOP talking points, which leads me to think that maybe he didn't vote for Obama in 2008, and he certainly didn't vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Look, the convention its ratings are down, significantly down from where the Democrats were. That's going to drive Trump nuts. And almost half of the people who are watching are on Fox. That means they're just talking to the already converted. Last week, I was really engaged and impressed by the Democratic convention and the way Stephanie Cutter put it together with her team. At something new, something interesting every single night. This convention is, for me, tedious, divisive, and a parade of lies. Joe Biden's going to defund the police. Joe Biden supports rioters. Joe Biden is the candidate of China, and on and on and on. And the few moments that are a little different, I think the expectations are so low that the press overcredits them. So Melania Trump actually says she feels sorry for the people who have died from COVID, and people say, oh, that was an amazing speech. That's actually a line that should have been uttered by the president and the first lady months and months and months ago.
Can I stop you there, Bob? I was just having this conversation with my producers before we went on air. I'm just livid at the response of the media around that speech by Melania Trump. The bar is so low because she basically plagiarized Michelle Obama in 2016. And now she's getting all of this praise and applause because she mentioned the 180,000 dead. She said her husband is going to work tirelessly to fight for everybody that's been impacted by COVID. And I'm sitting there thinking, where have you been? Why haven't we seen you out talking to families that have been impacted by COVID-19? Why haven't we seen you, speaking to the lies and misinformation that your husband is spreading about this virus? And for her now to use the Rose Guard, let's talk, we'll talk about the Hatch Act and all of the violations that we have seen over the last couple of days. But for you to use the people's house to strut out like you're, I don't know, walking the stage at a beauty contest or something, and to stand there and to suggest that your husband is a champion for women, is a champion for African Americans, that he's embracing people of all colors. I was appalled by her speech. And I'm now really appalled that media has not called her out for being the hypocrite that she is.
Sure, because there's a both sidism. It's like these stories about climate change, where they find a climate denier to balance the person who's worried about climate. I think it's a sickness in journalism, and I think somebody has to do something about it, hopefully at some point. You mentioned the Rose Garden. I just want to say, I hope that the first thing that Joe Biden does as First Lady is restore Jackie Kennedy's Rose Garden. Yes. I mean, those trees were ripped out. There was a cement pathway put down the middle. Awful. And when Melania Trump gave that speech wearing what looked to me like a Russian military uniform, I listened to it and I thought, okay, this is kind of mediocre. And then I listened to the commentators afterwards and they said, oh, that was a real grace note in this convention. It wasn't. It was, I mean, but they want to have something where they can say, gee, the Republicans weren't so bad.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I hope that Jill Biden's first act is to restore that Rose Garden and to restore the separation of politics from governance. And that's what we've seen too, from the use of that federal auditorium to the use of those Marines in that, stage naturalization, charade that we watch is the blurring of the lines between what should happen with the People's House and what a political convention should look like. And although we know Trump is not bound by the Hatch Act, those federal employees that we saw opening the doors when he was giving that naturalization, exercise, those folks are bound. And so what do you make of that, Bob? Just the blatant disregard for norms and even laws, as we witnessed over the last 2 days.
I'm not surprised. This administration has been a 3.5-year exercise in breaking the law. And Mark Meadows, the White House chief of staff, said, oh, no one outside the Beltway cares about the Hatch Act. So it's just part of a pattern. I looked at that naturalization ceremony and I thought to myself, I wonder how many immigrants and how many Latinx voters are going to be fooled by that. I don't think a lot. I watched that state representative from Georgia, who's African American, give that speech where he lied over and over and over again. And I wondered how many African Americans are actually going to fall for that, because they're living with a different reality in their lives. A convention can't change the reality. It can't change the reality of COVID. It can't change the reality of what's going on with the economy. It can't change the reality of racial strife. I do think that there's one thing that worries me as we look ahead. I think it's very important for people to take John Lewis's advice. Not violence, voting. Mm-hmm. People can change things if they will go vote. If there's a lot of violence and a lot of riots, Trump is going to try to exploit it. He's going to maybe even send in federal troops and say, I am your law and order president. Now that campaign, which is borrowed from Richard Nixon in 1968, has a lot of problems. About 88% of voters in 1968 were white. Now it's down to 72%. Non-Hispanic whites in the census in 2010 were only 60%. So we have a demographically changed country. We also had the George Floyd episode, this latest Jacob Blake episode, where people can vividly see the police misconduct. And so I think they want it resolved. And that's why in most of the polling, Biden leads Trump on who can deal best with racial strife.
And I was going to say to that, Bob, yes, I've read all these studies that talk about how violence in the street could play to the favor of Trump. But I think they ignore an important point you just made, is that we're looking at a very different electorate. We're looking at more African Americans, more Latinos, and even more whites acknowledging that those protests in the street lead to real policy changes. I had Cori Bush on the show a couple of days ago, and she came out of the Ferguson protest movement and she beat Lacey Clay. She took down a 50-year family dynasty in St. Louis, Missouri. Clay Sr. and then Clay Jr. both held that seat, that congressional seat, for over 50 years. And it was Cori Bush who came out of that protest movement, who is now likely headed to Congress after this November election. So I think people see the protest movement, even though sometimes there is violence, there's still this sense based on all the polling that these protests matter and that they are moving the needle on police reform and race relations in this country.
Well, I think that's true. I would again have one caution. We have to draw a clear distinction, as Joe Biden has done, between peaceful protests and rioting and looting. It's a lie that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party support rioters, support looting, support violence. You almost wish John Lewis, for a lot of reasons, I wish John Lewis was still here. One of them is the clarity of his voice at a time like this, I think would make a big difference.
No, absolutely. I want to go back to the convention, though. There were so many moments, and I'm struggling with even how to, frame it because there's so much I want to talk to you about. But let's talk about the video that of Kimberly, the ex-wife of Gavin Newsom, the girlfriend of Don Jr., who has, spawned this whole challenge, the Kimberly challenge online. What do you make of her claim that, she's family, an immigrant family, and we know her mom is from Puerto Rico. And if you live in Puerto Rico, you are an American citizen, you're not an immigrant. So again, just the gaslighting that we've seen in this convention. Was that one of the worst moments, or for you,
Oh no, it was ridiculous. I mean, I kept thinking that earmuff salesmen were going to do well all over the country, because even if you put your earmuffs on, you could hear her shouting. I suspect if you turned off the TV, you could have heard her shouting. But the idea of getting up there and saying, I'm a first generation American. My father, like my mother, who came from Puerto Rico, was an immigrant, just reveals a mindset where someone actually thinks that Puerto Rico is some alien other place when it's part of the United States. They probably think it's alien and other because it's populated by Latinos.
Brown people.
It's populated by brown people. I thought Kimberly Guilfoyle just did not help.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the suburbs. So what we know about day one, it was doom and gloom. If you don't vote for Trump again, anarchists are going to invade your communities, and Western civilization as we know it is going to be gone. And actually that was, quoted by one of the speakers. But day two seemed to have been an effort to recast Donald Trump. He was talked about in ways that didn't even resemble the real man as we know him, but it was really a play for African-American voters. We saw that whole pardoning of that bank robber that took place, and his love fest with the FBI agent. Now, no mention of Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, George Floyd, and the African Americans that have been killed by police. And Nikki Haley did the same thing, Bob. She said, Black lives matter when you're a Black person being shot by another Black person. But in her litany of Black lives that matter, she never mentioned African American men killed by police. So in this effort to paint Trump as the pro-immigrant, pro-African American, pro-suburban women president, do you think it's going to change that number? Because we know Biden's leading in the suburbs now by 9 to 11 points, depending on the poll. Do you think this day two message will resonate with suburban voters?
No, but that was its purpose. They understand that most African Americans are not going to fall for this. They're too smart. They understand what's happening in their lives. But the hope is that some of the folks in the suburbs, like one of your earlier guests, who say they're really upset with Trump because of Charlottesville, because of all the other things that have happened, will say, gee, maybe he's okay in terms of race relations. I doubt that will work either. And I would also add that last night had the kind of touches you're talking about, but it also didn't give up on the rhetoric of we're in danger, only Trump can save us. That's going to become their basic argument from now until the election.
Yeah, and one of the other themes that we keep hearing, Bob, in day one and day two, socialist, Marxist, communist. We saw the older gentleman from Florida who was emotional, almost in tears, talking about, he knows what it's like to live in a communist country, and actually just suggesting that somehow under Biden, we're going to become a socialist country. Is that, messaging? Do you think that's resonating with anyone?
No, yeah, with the base, but the base is too small. He can't win with the base. Look, what's happening here, and I think law and order is one of the pieces they hope sticks. They're throwing spaghetti up against the wall, hoping that some argument, some piece of what they're saying will work. So far, none of it has. Now, we'll have to wait and see after this convention whether or not these polls tighten, except with the exception of an outlier CNN poll, the polls haven't tightened. It's a myth. I hear people talking about it on television. The average is about 9 points. nationally. Our USC Dornsife poll is 11 points. So we'll have to see if it tightens. I don't think this convention is going to have that impact. And by the way, of course, we have really low expectations for how well and with what civility Donald Trump will perform on Thursday night. I suspect he'll meet those low expectations.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to Thursdays at some point, and I've heard so many Democrats and reasonably minded people saying that they could barely watch it because of lies. And you saw MSNBC and CNN trying to fact check on the spot in some instances, but they were the lies were coming so quickly that it was really kind of hard to even fact check what was being said. But I wonder, Bob, about voter suppression. So in some ways, this whole convention is about suppressing the vote because it's about scaring you in ways about your vote in November. Do you think the Democrats are doing enough to fight against the voter suppression efforts that we saw in 2016? The misinformation campaigns online, the snippets, like Mike from New York said that Cuomo and Newsom praised Donald Trump on the coronavirus. And they did make some positive statements about him, but they have been consistently critical of him. But do you think these voter suppression efforts are going to work this time around?
First of all, by the way, the Cuomo and Newsom praise basically were hostage videos. They were desperate to get some of the federal resources into their states, so they were saying something nice about the president. Democrats are doing a very good job at this. There's a lawyer in Washington named Mark Elias who has been suing in court after court after court and winning to try to protect voting rights. Stacey Abrams is doing a terrific job on this. The Republicans and of course this is a double-edged sword I'll talk about in a minute. The Republicans want to tell people basically you have to risk your life to vote. That's why mail-in voting is bad. Now, the problem is that a lot of Republicans vote by mail. In Florida, seniors who are, in many cases, Republicans, vote by mail. So you have a lot of Republican state chairmen tearing their hair out as the president trashes vote by mail. Look, what's going to happen is we're not going to have an election night. Unless Biden wins by a big margin, we won't know who the winner is probably until maybe a week after the election. Maybe 2 weeks after the election. And that's fine. What's wrong with that? And I mean, that happens in other countries. In Ireland, they vote and then they don't even count that night. They start counting the next day and then they keep counting for several days afterwards. But the president is going to, when that happens, is going to say it's rigged, they're stealing it. He's going to create an alienation for about 30% of Americans where we could see some violence in the streets coming from disaffected Trump supporters, and then maybe answers and maybe clashes that come from people who are for Biden. So he will do anything to get reelected. And one reason for that is that once he's out of office, maybe he can pardon himself on the way out the door. But once he's out of office, he's subject to all these state investigations that are going on now. And my suspicion is, for example, that he's clearly violated all sorts of securities laws by understating his income when he's reporting to the federal government and overstating his assets, income, and net worth when he's applying for bank loans. So he'll do anything to try to win this election. So I don't think that election night will be a happy time. I think it will be a time of like all the rest of the Trump time that we've lived through, a time of incredible tension and outrage.
Chaos and drama, which has been the hallmarks of this administration. Before I let you go, Bob, quick predictions on those critical swing states. We know that Trump narrowly won in Michigan and in Florida. We know, again, as we talked about in the suburbs where he was leading, like in North Carolina, up by 24 points leading into the election in 2016. He's now underwater in the suburbs. What are your predictions for Michigan and Florida?
Well, look, he drew to an inside straight last time. You change 38,000 votes in 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and Hillary Clinton as president. I don't know if you play poker, but it's really hard to draw to an inside straight 2 times in a row. So I think he's underwater. I think they're making every argument they can. They're trying to humanize him, which is a really difficult task. And they're trying to scare people. And I predict by the end of this, all they will be doing is trying to scare people. And probably the October surprise will be one of two things. Either they'll say, we have a vaccine, even if it's not ready, or Attorney General Barr, who is a disgrace to that office, will do something like indict Hunter Biden.
Wow. Okay, we got to leave it there, Bob. I'm with you. As a lawyer, I've been thinking a lot about Trump's legal troubles, and I've been saying over and over again that his motivation to stay in office is not just about his power, it's about his freedom. And somebody that's fighting for their freedom will do anything, including break the law to try to, prevent themselves from being subjected to the law. And that's what we're seeing in this case. So again, thank you, Bob, for your insights. We're going to be following this election very closely over the next 60, some odd days until we get to November. And the message that you and all of our guests continue to deliver is the importance of voting and voting early. Again, thanks so much, Bob, for joining me this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wow,
Great to see you.
there's so much going on with this election, and we're just 2 days into this convention. There's still 2 days to go. So if you haven't been paying attention, you may want to tune in because this is going to be the most critical election of our lifetimes. All of us, I want to thank my guests for their insights and for joining me this morning on this critical conversation. You can continue to be a part of the conversation by following me at Ariva Martin on all social platforms. But before I get out, my words to live by. Donald Trump and the RNC give new meaning to the word shameless. Now, in some ways, all conventions are one big theatrical performance where the host party gets to cherry pick the best of the candidate and have others try to convince you that anything other than those selected moments in the candidate's life is irrelevant or non-existent. And the Democrats engaged in some of these theatrics for sure last week, but the RNC and Trump have taken theater to a whole new level. Watching the last 2 days of the RNC was like reading a bad fiction novel. In the words of a New York Times opinion writer, the RNC was less a feat of pretty storytelling and more an act of pure derangement. In trying to convince us that Trump is worthy of a second term, speaker after speaker conjured up a completely new Donald Trump, one that embraces Democrats, racial minorities, immigrants, and who is full of empathy for his fellow Americans. I did not recognize this Donald Trump. It is surely not the man that's currently occupying the White House. The speakers literally ask us to suspend reality, indisputable facts, and the last 3.5 years of Trump's words and actions, his divisive and racially charged language and tweets, his mishandling of the coronavirus, his attacks on iconic civil rights leaders like John Lewis, his tear gassing of peaceful protesters, his criminal acts involving Stormy Daniels, and the list just goes on and on and on. But according to the RNC, that reality show that we watch, none of these things ever happen. Larry Kudlow even used the past tense in describing the coronavirus, even though for the past few weeks, 1,000 people a day have continued to die from COVID. This level of shamelessness to convince people to vote for Trump ought to scare every American, and it should convince you that your vote is more important than ever. And no amount of props, staging, and lighting can change the fact that Trump has spent the last 3 years tearing down just about every American institution that we revere in this country. And last night he had the gall, the unmitigated gall, to use the White House and the Rose Garden as if they were one of his failed resort properties, using the nation's and the public's house to stage that naturalization ceremony and that pardon that he did. And then to invite guests into the Rose Garden to listen to Melania Trump drone on about how her husband cares about kids and families. These were all the acts of a monarch, not an American president. But see, we have an opportunity to teach Trump a civics lesson on November 3rd. We get to teach him that Marines and immigrants aren't props and that he is not a king. And he will only learn this lesson if we vote. And I mean, if we vote like our lives depend on it. I'm out, y'all. Be safe. Don't forget to wear your mask. And remember, we are all in this together.